they go to the roars of the crowd.
It's called the sport of kings. Its champions are national heroes.
Black Caviar, this Australian...
But as you stand trackside, this is what you hear as they pound toward the finish line. The rhythmic whacking of multiple whips. In the midst of a storm of public concern about the welfare of animals in racing, attention has focused once again on this instrument. An instrument that appears as if it inflicts violence. Are we beating our horses to the finish line?
Look, I just think the whole overarm hitting of horses is not a good perception. The general public are looking at it, we're punishing our champions.
It's become an extremely important issue because it is arguably the most visible form of violence to animals.
They don't hurt. The whips they got nowadays, no.
You could hit a person with these whips.
We are more than comfortably satisfied on all the available veterinary advice. If jockeys keep to the limit of strikes allowed for under the rules, there is no cruelty to a horse.
This is what a racing whip used to look like. And this is the new, softer, kinder, padded whip. It was made compulsory in 2009 and was meant to settle the controversy once and for all. As you can see, it has this stiff shaft and then a padded section at the end. I've been told it doesn't hurt. I've been told the industry would collapse without it. And I've also been told the opposite. So, which is it? Well, that's what I plan to investigate. As part of this investigation, we've asked a forensic veterinary pathologist to look into the pain-detecting nerve fibres of horses. Her surprising new findings later in the program. But I'd like to start with the word from the people who live closest to these beautiful creatures, the trainers and the jockeys.
I think they need a whip, certainly to help them focus.
I think it's the sound that the whip makes that persuades the horse to move forward.
We've had horses recently win group races, which is the elite level, without even using the whip. Why do they need it? Well, they just need it as a bit of a guidance tool.
The whip's there to encourage the horse to finish the race off, because you've got to remember, they've got a thicker hide than you and I. They're a 500-kilo animal, and if they want to bludge, they'll bludge.
While some perhaps express their opinion more colourfully than others, this appears to be the dominant view across the industry. A view once shared by top jockey Danny Brereton. But since his forced retirement a few years ago after a bad fall, Danny's feelings on the whip have changed.
You're correct, my views have changed a lot. Now I'm in the public and watching from the outside, and I can see the point of some people saying that the whip's cruel. I don't believe that it's actually, harms the horse, to the stage where it really hurts them. But my view on it is the perception it leaves is horrible.
Like his contemporaries, Danny was raised in a culture where the whip signified success. Even so, Danny was known as a hands and heels rider, minimising whip use in favour of maintaining balance. A riding style that in those days sometimes cost him.
Yes, I probably lost rides over it, but I liked that way I rode, and I believe that I didn't punish a horse as much as anyone else did, but I still got the best out of it.
Does the whip hurt?
The old whips, yes, the old whips did hurt. But in saying that, in any one day's racing, if I had eight rides or 6 rides, I'd have been struck with the whip myself probably 4 or 5 times through the day. So, yeah, it hurt me, but I wouldn't be coming home crying about it, if you know what I mean. Now this new padded whip, no, that's cut the hurt in half. I've been hit with those as well, and it has cut it down to 50%, yes.
But while Danny was struggling with his own convictions, elsewhere, a couple of veterinarians Danny had never even heard of were trying to tackle the same issue with science. Dr. Paul McGreevy is Professor of Animal Behaviour and Animal Welfare Science. Dr. David Evans is an equine exercise physiologist and consultant to the racing industry. Between them, since 2011, they've published a series of studies on the whip in racing, one of which was funded by the RSPCA. And perhaps the most compelling is this one. A frame-by-frame analysis of 15 races at Gosford Racetrack on June 2011, which reveals what's normally too quick to see.
83% of the time, there was a visible indentation. That deformation of the skin with a rod cannot be pleasant.
Horses received on average 6.5 strikes in the last 200 metres.
70% of the time, the abdomen was struck, the flank was struck.
The flank, this is this
The
sensitive part.
flank is the side of the abdomen.
Yeah. Even more concerning, this evidence clearly shows the unpadded shaft making contact in 64% of cases.
And that's important because the section between the padded and unpadded sections has a hard knot. So we know that 64% of the time that knot is hitting the horse.
The new rules on the use of the whip in racing introduced in 2009 are quite complex. So first of all, you must use one of these new padded whips. Secondly, there are two possible ways to hold a whip. This is what's called forehand. There's a limit on the number of forehand strikes. 5 strikes, non-consecutive strides, prior to the last 100 metres. Then in the last 100 metres, it's unlimited. This is what's called the backhand hold. There is no limit on the number of backhand strikes you can deliver in a race, the assumption being that you can't hit as hard backhand, and therefore, why limit it? To test the assumption that backhands are softer, Professor McGreevy recruited 6 practising jockeys and asked them to hit this pressure-detecting pad as if they were finishing a race.
So we found that when they were using their dominant hand, we were very surprised to find that this system picked up more force with the backhand, which isn't policed.
Right. If this is true, and jockeys can hit just as hard with a backhand, it would make a mockery of the backhand-forehand distinction in the rules. But while Paul, David and their colleagues are convinced what they're observing is painful,
I think it's aversive. I think they're trying to get away from it.
other scientists believe the opposite.
Peak force 54. We'll look at the contact area. Yeah.
This is equine scientist Dr. Glennis Noble and her master's student Jessica Dodd. Along with their co-researcher, racetrack veterinarian Dr. Peter Knight, they did their own study, partly because they doubted Professor McGreevy's findings.
Jockeys have always said that backhand whip strikes generate a lot less force. So the research was giving different results to what reality or what my perception of reality was.
Their study, part funded by the Australian racing industry, found the opposite to McGreevy. The forehand was stronger.
And so the conclusion was that the rules as they stand that put a limit on the use of the whip with the forehand action are actually justified and that they are looking after the welfare of the horses.
So there you have it. 2 sets of studies, one by welfare scientists, one part funded by the industry, different conclusions. It is worth pointing out, though, that Professor McGreevy and his colleagues' studies have all been published in peer-reviewed journals. The Noble and Knight study, at this point, has not. But one thing they share was the finding there's no such thing as a standard whip strike.
Huge variation, which is why, you know, likely there are some whip strikes that do hurt a horse, but there are probably a lot that don't.
So let's take this further now and hear from the people who make the whip rules, the Australian Racing Board. Its chief executive, Peter McGauran.
I believe that the whip has been modified. It's now padded. There are strict rules as to how often a jockey can strike a horse and in what manner. And I believe this does not inflict pain on a horse. It's instead part of the urging of a horse to extract the best possible performance. If there was any aspect of cruelty to it, neither I nor the many thousands of people who care tenderly and lovingly for these horses would have no part of it.
So what did you think of Dr McGreevy's findings that over 60% of strikes, the unpadded section hits the horse?
This is a concern to an extent. It does happen, but I believe, and so do the vets and so do jockeys, if you were to hit a horse in a sensitive area, such as the flank, and it was to hurt the horse would definitely shift.
But horses didn't shift when the old whip was used, even when it left marks. I'm not aware that it actually led to the horses behaviourally veering all over the course as a result of being whipped. They learned to tolerate it.
That would have been learned behaviour, agreed. Under the old days, I concede that the horses learned to absorb the punishment afforded them. They're not punished now. And particularly if they were hit on the flank, as Dr McGreevy suggests, they would definitely shift. If it was painful, a horse will shift if it's in pain, unless it's conditioned not to. And in these days, I don't believe they are conditioned.
That convoluted answer takes us to the heart of the trouble with assessing pain. If the horse has learned to tolerate it, how can you tell? Particularly when it's galloping flat out. So let's ask instead, is there any reason to think a whip strike doesn't cause pain in a horse? I've often heard people say that big animals might not feel things as acutely as we do because of their strength and size and their thick skin. Well, let's take a look at that idea. We've asked Dr. Lydia Tong, a veterinary pathologist and forensics researcher, to look into skin thickness and pain sensation in horses versus humans. Despite extensive literature research, Lydia was surprised to learn this had never been done before. As far as we're aware, what you're about to see is new to science.
Well, we've looked closely at human skin and horse skin from the same area on the flank.
What we're looking at here is the fibrous collagen layer of the skin and the thin outermost epidermis.
The really interesting part is that right up in the epidermis, which is the top layer, and that's where the pain-sensing C fibres are, in the human specimen, that's thicker than the horses. So by the old argument of horses' skin is thicker and they feel it less, actually, you could argue human skin's thicker.
Right. Oh, that's a surprise.
It is. It was unexpected, actually.
As you can see, the pain-sensing fibres stretch right up into the very surface of the skin. And to her and my astonishment, the density of nerve fibres, stained red, is higher in the horse. It looks like they may have more pain-sensing nerve endings in the flank than we do. Wow, that's fascinating. And no one's looked at this before?
No.
Even with a thin added layer of hair, the horse's acute skin sensitivity is on display all the time. One difference from humans, though, is that animals who evolved as prey are more likely to hide their pain.
If a prey animal shows its pain very overtly, they're more likely to then be noticed and picked off by a predator. So actually, often prey animals, they kind of shut up and push up. That's recognised.
So, given all this, there's no reason to think that something that would hurt a human wouldn't hurt a horse.
I think we should assume that it's likely to be painful.
And so, logic now leads me inevitably to the next step, to try it on myself. Knowing how controversial this would be, we weren't prepared to ask a current jockey to participate. So Jonathan MacLean, former jockey turned professional racehorse breaker, will wield the whip. As whip forces vary dramatically, our plan is to deliver 2 strikes of increasing intensity. You can go hard. Oh! It's stinging. It's stinging a lot. I mean, it's bearable. Of course, a horse in a race will have a body full of adrenaline, so may be paying less attention to the whip strike site than I am. But still, I can report it's still stinging slightly. Actually, look what's happened to the unpadded bit. The unpadded knot has created an obvious welt. 10 minutes on, thermal imaging shows the impact clearly, with a 1 degree temperature rise indicating some inflammation.
Did it hurt more than you thought?
No, probably a little less.
Now the stronger strike, simulating a hard forehand hit. This hurt more and stung for longer and left a bruise where the knot hit.
3 degrees plus. So it's definitely improvement, this padded whip, but
Yeah.
it still can inflict pain depending on the
Yeah.
speed of the whip. That's
Yeah.
what it seems to show.
Yeah. Oh, they all hurt. All those strikes hurt. It was just how long the hurt lasted. Yeah. Well, I'm convinced the padded whip can inflict pain. But there's other science to suggest that the way many jockeys use the whip doesn't even make horses go faster. In fact, it can do the opposite. Dr. Andrew MacLean is a zoologist with a PhD in neuroscience. His area is learning theory. He's going to show us why repeated strikes of a whip don't actually work.
The basis of training is actually negative reinforcement, the removal of pressure, and it's the removal that trains. It's the removal that reinforces the behaviour. So, for example, with this horse, if I want the horse to move backwards, so if I poke it like this, I'll get no reaction. And if I keep doing it, the horse might find it irritating, and then soon he may give a reaction like that, and I stop immediately.
And so the reward is that you stopped.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
If we kept hitting the horse after the horse has already given the reaction, then the horse doesn't know what the right answer is because we've kept on using an aversive stimulus when he's given the right answer. You're punishing the response you actually intended to produce.
So you're punishing the horse.
Yeah.
It doesn't know what's going on. It just learns to tolerate those hits.
And it learns that when you're ridden, random acts of pain occur. And that's not really a recipe for a secure life.
The better jockeys understand this. Hugh Bowman, one of the best in Australia, is known for his sparing use of the whip.
I would say 80 to 90% of horses can't run any faster by being hit by the whip. They certainly might respond to 1 or 2 hits, might just help them focus and extend into their top gear, but no matter how much you hit them, really, they can only go so fast.
And Hugh Bowman's professional opinion as a jockey is backed up by biochemistry.
ATP has to be resynthesised for an animal to keep running fast.
That's the fuel the horse needs to keep on keeping on.
If there was no limit to the rate of ATP resynthesis, an animal would just run faster and faster and faster and eventually die. So fatigue is important for survival.
So what does that tell you, most of the whippings in the last 100 metres?
It tells me that they're being whipped during fatigue, where they're going to find it very difficult to muster any meaningful response.
But if there's one horse that proves you don't need a whip to win, it's this one. Black Caviar, our greatest and most loved horse since Phar Lap. Her jockeys were forbidden to use the whip. Her trainer, Peter Moody, once famously saying to her jockey, "You hit our girl, I'll hit you." So what would happen if the whip were taken out of the racing equation? In Norway, the UK and India, they've successfully run whip-free races where a whip can still be carried for safety reasons but not used to encourage speed.
I don't know why they can't just implement races here and there where the whip's not to be used. Maybe on young horses could be something to be tried and see what happens. It could be even experimented to say no striking behind the saddle.
You don't think it'll be the end of the world?
No, there will still eight or 9 races and there'll be 8 or 9 winners.
There's no doubt there's a change in racing culture underway. When some limits on whips were introduced in 2009, the jockeys went on strike. By 2014, we saw the jockeys themselves berate their colleague for using too much whip. The question is, how far should that culture change go? All the trainers and jockeys I have spoken to have stressed how much they love horses and care about their welfare, and I absolutely believe that. But I struggle to share their view that there's no pain involved. The whip rules are currently under review, with a report expected in May. All indications are they'll be tightened, with probably new restrictions on backhand hits. But we, the community, will still be left with how do we feel about this? Horses being hit overarm repeatedly in the name of sport, when the science tells me many of those hits hurt. If in your heart of hearts you began to suspect that it did, what then?
Oh, definitely. You would further restrict it or abolish it. You can't say you believe it does not inflict pain, and then, if evidence was to the contrary, you continue. Of course we would do away with the whip.
And there'd be a hue and cry, of course. But racing would carry on. There'd still be champions, there'd still be a black caviar, wouldn't there?